Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are doing something a little different. Usually, we take a stack of articles from the last week or two, maybe a new white paper that just dropped, and we try to make sense of the current moment. But today, we are going back, way back.
To 1859, to be precise.
1859. And honestly, as I was reading through the source material for this deep dive, I had this really eerie feeling. You know that feeling when you read a horoscope and it's just a little too accurate?
I know exactly the feeling, yes.
That is how I felt reading John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. It felt like it could have been written this morning, maybe in response to a Twitter thread or, a heated cable news debate. It addresses the exact anxieties we have right now about cancel culture, about government overreach, about the pressure to conform.
It really does have that timeless quality. And, it's not just some dusty old philosophy book. On Liberty is arguably one of the most influential works of political philosophy ever written.
That's a huge claim.
It is. But what makes it so gripping isn't just the high-minded theory, it's the urgency. You can feel it on the page. Mill felt that the walls were closing in on the individual, and he wanted to push back. Hard.
So we're going to spend the next hour really unpacking this beast. And I don't want to just skim the surface. I think we need to get into the weeds here because the nuance is where all the magic is. We're going to talk about dead dogmas. We're going to talk about the tyranny of your neighbors. And we're going to talk about why you should probably, listen to people you think are absolutely crazy.
That is a perfect roadmap.
But before we get to the heavy-hitting arguments, and there are some very heavy hitters here, we have to set the stage. What exactly is Mill talking about when he says liberty? Because I feel like that word gets thrown around so much.
All the time.
In America, it's on the coins, it's in the pledge. But what does Mill mean?
It's a crucial distinction, and he makes it right out of the gate. Mill clarifies that he is not talking about liberty of the will.
Okay, what's that?
He's not getting into that dense metaphysical debate about whether we are predestined to do things or if we have true free will in a cosmic sense. He just sweeps that entire conversation off the table.
So we aren't debating if I chose to drink this coffee this morning or if the universe made me do it.
Exactly. He's talking about civil or social liberty. He is interested in the nature and the limits of the power that can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. It's a political and a social question, not a theological or metaphysical one.
Okay, so the mission of this deep dive really is to find out, where does my freedom end and society's power begin?
Precisely. And before we dive into the history, I think it's really worth noting the dedication at the beginning of the book. It adds a really human layer to this intellectual powerhouse.
Oh yeah, I saw that. He dedicates it to his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill.
He does, and he credits her as the inspirer and part author of his best work. He actually says she possessed all but unrivaled wisdom.
Wow, that's high praise.
It's incredible praise. There is a lot of historical debate about how much she actually wrote, but Mill certainly believes she was his intellectual equal, if not his superior. It's just a touching reminder that this wasn't just a man in an ivory tower. This was a thinker who was deeply connected to a partner who shaped his entire worldview.
That is sweet. But let's get into the scary stuff, the historical context. Mill starts by taking us on a bit of a journey through how we used to think about liberty versus how we think about it now, and uses a pretty graphic metaphor involving vultures.
The vulture metaphor is classic Mill. It really helps you visualize the old times, as he calls them. In the old model of politics, liberty was understood almost purely as protection against the tyranny of political rulers.
The king, the aristocrats, that sort of thing.
Exactly. You had a king or a tribe of aristocrats, the people in charge, and the people were the subjects. The ruler was, in a way, necessary. You needed a king of the vultures, as he puts it, to keep the minor harpies, the smaller criminals or foreign invaders, away from the flock.
Right. So better to have one big monster ruling you than 1,000 little monsters just picking you apart.
Exactly. But you still had to worry that the king vulture would get hungry and decide to eat the flock himself.
Of course.
So in this old world, liberty was all about setting limits on the ruler's power. You did this by fighting for political rights or immunities, and then later by setting up constitutional checks. Think of the Magna Carta. It's all about building a cage for the vulture.
Okay, so that's the old school fight. Barons forcing King John to sign the paper, keeping the king in his box. But then Mill says something shifted, a big shift. We stopped looking at rulers as enemies. We started looking at them as well as us.
Right. This is the transition to democratic thinking, and this is where it gets really tricky. People began to think, why should we limit the power of the government if the government is us? The idea arose that rulers should be delegates, revocable at the people's pleasure.
And the logic was?
The logic was, the nation doesn't need to be protected against its own will. There was no fear of the people tyrannizing themselves.
Which sounds great on paper. We are the government, so whatever we do is fine, because we are doing it to ourselves. It's consensual. It's self-government.
That was the optimistic dream of the 18th century. But Mill comes along in the mid-19th and says, hold on a second, that's a trap.
Why is it a trap? I mean, if I vote for the guy, and my neighbor votes for the guy, and he makes a law,
Yeah.
are we just governing ourselves?
Mill calls this the new danger. He points out that phrases like self-government and the power of the people over themselves are really deceptive. They don't reflect reality.
How so?
Because the people who exercise the power are not always the same people as those over whom it is exercised.
Break that down for me. Who are the two peoples?
Well, when we talk about the will of the people, we are never talking about the unanimous will of every single person. It's just not possible. We are talking about the majority. Or, even more cynically, as Mill says, the most active, loud, and organized part of the people.
So the people is just a nice way of saying the winners.
In effect, yes. And this majority may desire to oppress a part of their number. And this leads us to one of the most famous and crucial concepts in the entire book, the tyranny of the majority.
I feel like we hear that phrase a lot, tyranny of the majority. But usually people just mean, I lost the election and I'm mad. Mill means something much, much deeper, doesn't he?
So much deeper. He's not just talking about political acts. He's not just talking about the majority passing a law that says everyone must wear blue hats or something like that. He argues that society itself is the tyrant.
Society itself.
And he says this social tyranny is actually more formidable than many kinds of political oppression.
How? I mean, how is my neighbor scarier than the government? A king can chop my head off. My neighbor can just, what, give me a dirty look.
A king can chop your head off, true. But a king is distant. You can hide from a king. You can pay your taxes, keep your head down, and mostly live your private life. But social tyranny. Mill has this incredible line. He says it leaves fewer means of escape, penetrating much more deeply into the details of life and enslaving the soul itself.
Enslaving the soul. Wow. That is a heavy, heavy line.
It's incredibly heavy. He's talking about the pressure to conform. It's the collective opinion imposing its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them.
It's that feeling that you must think and act like everyone else or face social ostracization. It's the silence at the dinner table when you have a different political opinion. It's the fear of being the weirdo.
Yes, or being called out online. It's the feeling that there is a correct way to think, a correct way to live, and if you deviate, you aren't thrown in jail, but you are frozen out. You're made invisible.
That is terrifyingly accurate to the modern experience. It's the cancel culture debate or just the constant pressure of social media. But he's writing this in 1859.
Precisely. And Mill argues that this is actually more effective at killing individuality than in prison. If you are in prison, you can be a martyr. Your mind can still be free. But if you are slowly, daily, crushed by the weight of social disapproval, your mind itself starts to warp. You stop even thinking the dangerous thought because it's just too painful.
So, Mill sees this creeping conformity, this social tyranny, and he says we need a hard line. We can't just rely on feeling what's right and wrong. We need a rule. We need a principle to tell us when society can step in and when it absolutely has to back off.
Correct. He is looking for a principle to determine the limit of legitimate interference, and he boils it all down to what is now famously known as the harm principle.
Okay, let's unpack this. This is the golden rule of the entire book. What is the harm principle?
The principle is this, and the wording is very specific. The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection.
Self-protection. Okay.
That is the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will to prevent harm to others.
Okay, so if I'm about to punch you in the face, society can stop me. That's easy. I'm harming you.
Yes, that is clear-cut. That's a direct harm.
But what about all the other stuff? What if I want to do something that you think is bad for me? What if I want to eat unhealthy food until I have a heart attack? What if I want to gamble my rent money away? What if I just want to be a lazy slacker and waste all my potential?
Mill is categorical here. He says the individual's own good, whether physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant for interference.
Not at all.
Not for compulsion. You cannot compel someone to do something just because it will make them happier or because, in the opinion of others, it would be wise or even right.
So no paternalism.
Mm-hmm.
The government can't be my dad. Society can't be my dad.
No coercion. Now, Mill is very clear. He doesn't say we have to be indifferent. We can reason with the person. We can remonstrate with him. We can persuade him. We can entreat him.
You can beg them to stop.
We can beg, but we cannot compel him. We cannot visit him with any evil in case he does otherwise. And that's where he drops that famous line. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign.
That is such a powerful statement. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. But I have to play devil's advocate here. Are there exceptions? Surely there are. Does this apply to everyone? What about my 5-year-old niece?
No, and that's a crucial distinction he makes immediately. Mill explicitly states this doctrine is meant to apply only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties, so not children, not young persons below the age defined by law. They still need protection against their own actions.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't let a toddler run into traffic.
Right. And somewhat controversially for modern readers, he also excludes what he calls backward states of society.
Ah, the barbarians clause. I was waiting for this.
Yes. We have to view this in the context of the 19th century British Empire. He argues that liberty, as a principle, has no application to any state of things anterior to the time when mankind have become capable of being improved by free and equal discussion.
So if a society's in chaos, or barbaric, as he would put it, they aren't ready for this kind of liberty.
In his view, yes. He says that for them, there is nothing but implicit obedience to an Akbar or a Charlemagne, if they are lucky enough to find one. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians.
But there's a huge caveat.
A huge one, provided the end is their improvement. The despotism has to be aimed at getting them to the point where they can be improved by discussion. Once they reach that level, compulsion is no longer admissible.
So basically, until you're grown up enough as a society to learn from debate, you just have to do what the wise leader tells you.
Yeah.
But once you reach that level of civilization, compulsion is off the table, except to prevent harm to others.
Precisely. And from this one simple principle, Mill branches out into 3 main areas of liberty. The first, and perhaps the most extensively argued, is the liberty of thought and discussion.
This section is massive, and it starts with a scenario that I absolutely love. It's like a sci-fi setup. Mill poses a hypothetical question. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, would mankind be justified in silencing that one person?
It's the ultimate majority versus one scenario, and his answer is a resounding, unequivocal no.
Why not? I mean, let's be real. If 7 billion people think the Earth is round, and one guy says it's a cube, why do we need to listen to the cube guy? He's clearly wrong, he's annoying. Why not just mute him and get on with our day?
Because, Mill says, silencing that opinion is robbing the human race. And note the word robbing. He thinks we are losing something incredibly valuable, and he argues it's a specific kind of robbery that hurts the silencers more than it hurts the silenced.
Wait, it hurts the people doing the censoring more than the guy being censored. How does that work?
Because of 2 possibilities. First, if the opinion is right, if the cube guy is somehow correct, then the majority is deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth.
Okay, that makes sense.
But if the opinion is wrong, which is the case with your cube Earth guy, they lose what is almost as great a benefit: the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error.
So we need the error to really understand the truth. We need the friction.
Exactly. You need the friction to keep the truth sharp. So Mill breaks this down into 3 main hypotheses to prove why we must never, ever silence any opinion.
All right, let's take them one by one. This is the meat of the argument. Hypothesis number 1. The silenced opinion may be true.
This brings us to what's called the infallibility argument. Mill argues that to refuse a hearing to an opinion because you are sure it is false is to assume that your certainty is the same thing as absolute certainty. In other words, it is to assume you are infallible.
But people know they aren't infallible, right? Like practically everyone admits they make mistakes. I'm only human and all that.
In theory, yes. But Mill observes that while everyone knows they are fallible, very few people think it necessary to take any precautions against their own fallibility. And here's the interesting psychological point he makes. People rely on their world for certainty.
What does he mean by their world? My bubble.
Your bubble, exactly. For some, their world is their political party. For others, it's their church, their sect, their class of society. They essentially devolved the responsibility of being right onto this collective authority. If everyone I know and respect thinks X is true, then X must be true.
It's the echo chamber.
It is the 19th century version of the echo chamber, and Mill points out the total accident of this. He says the same causes that make a man a churchman in London would have made him a Buddhist or a Confucian in Peking. You are just a product of your geography and time.
That is such a great perspective check. You think your beliefs are these absolute hard-won truths, but if you'd been born 3,000 miles to the east, you'd have completely different absolute truths.
Right. And Mill says ages are just as fallible as individuals. We look back at past ages and we think, wow, they believed some ridiculous things. We laugh at them for burning witches or believing the sun revolved around the earth. But future ages will absolutely look back at us and think the same about some of our cherished truths.
Okay, but surely there's a counter-argument here. The guy in charge of the censorship committee says, look, I get it. I know I'm not God. I know I might be wrong, but I have to act on my convictions. If I see someone spreading dangerous lies that will hurt people, surely it's my duty to stop them. I can't just stand by and let the world burn because of some philosophical possibility that I might be wrong.
It's a compelling argument. It's the argument of every censor in history. I'm doing this to protect you. Mill's rebuttal to this is so sharp. He says there is the greatest difference between presuming an opinion to be true, because with every opportunity for contesting it, it has not been refuted, and assuming its truth for the purpose of not permitting its refutation.
That's a bit of a tongue twister. Break that down.
Basically, you can only trust your truth if you have invited the entire world to punch it in the face as hard as they can and it's still standing. If you build a wall around your truth to protect it from being punched, you can't actually trust that it's true at all.
He uses the example of the devil's advocate here, which I love.
He does. He points to the Roman Catholic Church, which he wasn't a huge fan of, but he respected their process. Even when they want to canonize a saint, the holiest of men, they appoint a devil's advocate whose job it is to argue against it.
So they have to find every possible flaw.
They won't admit a saint to posthumous honors until all that the devil could possibly say against him is known and has been weighed. So Mill's point is, if even the Pope has to listen to the devil, surely we should listen to a simple dissenter.
And then to really drive this point home, Mill gets historical. He proves that good men, the best of men, can make terrible, terrible mistakes when they try to silence opinions. He brings out the big guns.
These examples are absolutely devastating. He starts with Socrates,
The father of Western philosophy.
the master of all eminent thinkers, as Mill calls him. And what happened to her? He was put to death by his countrymen. He was forced to drink hemlock. And why? The official charges were impiety and immorality, specifically for corrupting the youth.
The people who killed Socrates weren't, monsters. They thought they were protecting their children from a dangerous radical.
They saw him as a threat to their way of life. And then he brings up an even more powerful example. Jesus.
Right.
The man who left such an impression of moral grandeur that 18 centuries have done homage to him as the Almighty in person. He was ignominiously put to death.
As what? As a blasphemer.
And Mill makes a really crucial point here about the people who did these things. They weren't cartoon villains twirling their mustaches.
No, and that's the truly scary part. He says the high priest who tore his garments in horror at Jesus' words was likely just as sincere and respectable as any pious man today. He felt he was doing a holy duty by condemning this man. Mill reminds us that St. Paul himself was one of those persecutors before his conversion on the road to Damascus.
And then he brings up the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. For me, this one hits the hardest. This is perhaps the most tragic and compelling example. Marcus Aurelius was the absolute monarch of the entire civilized world. He was a Stoic philosopher. His writings, the Meditations, are still read today as the highest ethical product of the ancient mind. He was a good man in every conceivable sense of the word, and yet he persecuted Christianity.
Why? Why would a philosopher king, a man of such integrity, persecute the Christians?
Because he sincerely believed that the traditional Roman society and its beliefs held everything together. He looked at Christianity and saw it as a dissolving force, a strange new atheism that would tear Rome apart from the inside. He saw it as his solemn duty to put it down to save civilization.
So Mill's question is,
if Marcus Aurelius, one of the wisest and best men to ever live, could be so profoundly wrong about this, who among us can claim to be right enough to silence others? If he could fail, anyone can.
that really drives it home. If the best of us can be tragically wrong, none of us are safe to play the role of censor. But what about the argument that Truth always triumphs. You hear this a lot. If it's true, you can't kill it. Persecution is just an ordeal that truth has to pass through to prove itself.
Mill calls this a pleasant falsehood. It's a nice, comforting thing to tell ourselves, but he says history absolutely teems with instances of truth being put down by persecution.
For good.
For centuries, yes. He says the Reformation broke out at least 20 times before Luther, and it was put down every single time. The Albigenses, the Vaudois, the Lollards, the Hussites, all movements with elements of truth that were crushed.
So persecution actually works.
It works very well, unfortunately. Mill says it is a piece of idle sentimentality to think that truth has some inherent power to prevail against the dungeon and the stake. Persecution generally succeeds unless the heretics are too strong a party to be effectively persecuted. Truth may be rediscovered centuries later, but you can absolutely kill it for a long, long time.
Okay, that's a pretty definitive takedown of Hypothesis 1. We can't silence an opinion because we might be silencing the truth. Now, Hypothesis 2. Let's assume the silenced opinion is definitely 100% false. Let's say it's the moon is made of cheese. Why do we still need to hear it? Why waste our time debating something so obviously stupid?
This is the argument against what Mill calls dead dogma. He argues that even if the received opinion is true, if it isn't fully, frequently, and fearlessly discussed, it will be held as a dead dogma, not a living truth.
The difference, what does he mean by a dead dogma?
It means we forget the grounds of our opinion. We parrot the words, but we don't understand the why. The belief becomes a shell, a set of words we repeat without any real comprehension of their meaning.
So we know the what, but not the why.
Exactly. Mill compares it to math versus morals. In mathematics, there is no wrong side to the argument. 2 + 2 = 4. You don't need to hear someone argue it's 5 to understand why it's 4. But in subjects like morals, religion, and politics, he says 75% of the argument consists of dispelling the appearances which favor the other side.
So truly know your own side, you have to know the other side's arguments.
Better than they do. He quotes Cicero, the great Roman orator, who said he always studied his adversary's case with greater intensity than his own. Mill says if you can't refute the reasons on the opposite side, if you don't know what they are, you have no ground for your own opinion. You're just following the herd.
And he talks about the deep slumber of a decided opinion. That if we don't have to fight for our beliefs, they lose their power over us. They stop influencing our behavior.
Right, and he uses Christianity as an example again, but this time to show how modern believers hold their faith. He says the early Christians felt their creed vividly. Why? Because they were surrounded by enemies. They were being thrown to lions. They knew exactly why they were Christians, down to their bones.
But modern Christians in his time,
he says they believe the doctrines just up to the point to which it is usual to act upon them. He has that very biting line about how they believe, blessed are the poor and judge not lest you be judged, but they act entirely according to the custom of their class and nation.
So the creed is just there. It's inert.
It stands as a sentinel outside the mind to keep it empty of other ideas, rather than actually regulating their conduct. It's become a dead dogma. To make it a living truth again, it needs to be challenged. We need the moon cheese guy to force us to explain gravity and geology and the evidence from the Apollo missions.
Okay, so we need dissent to keep our own truths alive and meaningful. Now, Hypothesis 3. And Melba, this is actually the most common case of all.
Yes, the partial truth. Usually in the real world, it's not that one side is 100% right and the other is 100% wrong. The reality is that conflicting doctrines usually share the truth between them.
It's not black and white.
It's almost never black and white. Popular opinions, the mainstream view, are often true, but seldom or never the whole truth. They are one-sided. And the heretical opinion, the dissenting view, even if it has some errors, usually contains the suppressed and neglected truths that the popular opinion is missing.
He gives the example of Jean-Jacques Rousseau here.
He does. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment was in full swing. Everyone was obsessed with civilization and science and reason and progress. And then Rousseau explodes onto the scene like a bombshell saying, no, nature and simplicity are better. Civilization makes us weak and corrupt.
Which seems a bit extreme.
Mill says Rousseau wasn't right. Going back to live in the woods isn't the answer, but he wasn't entirely wrong either. He held the missing half of the truth that the civilized people of his day were ignoring. He forced them to see the value in what they had lost.
And in politics, it's the same thing.
Same thing. A party of order or stability and a party of progress or reform. They're both necessary. They keep each other sane. If you only have a party of order, society stagnates. If you only have a party of progress, it tears itself apart. You need both.
And he goes back to Christian morality versus what he calls pagan self-assertion. This
Well,
part is really interesting because he basically claims that Christian morality as it was taught is incomplete.
He does. He argues that Christian morality, or what was commonly termed as such in his day, is essentially reactive. It's a lot of thou shalt not. He says it focuses on innocence rather than nobleness, on submission to authority rather than on dignity and self-development.
So it's about avoiding evil, not necessarily achieving good.
In his view, yes. And he argues we need the other side. We need the Greek ideal of self-development. We need the pagan virtues of courage, high-mindedness, a sense of honor. We need both the saint and the hero to have a complete human morality.
So the conclusion on thought and discussion is, we need freedom of opinion, not just for the great thinkers, the geniuses, but for average people to attain their full mental stature.
Precisely. You cannot have an intellectually active and courageous people in an atmosphere of mental slavery. And he ends with that warning. A state that dwarfs its men in order that they may be more docile instruments in its hands will find that with small men, no great thing can really be accomplished.
All right, let's move on to section 2. We've talked a lot about thinking. Now let's talk about acting. Individuality as an element of well-being.
This is where the rubber really meets the road. Liberty of thought is pretty useless if you can't then act on your thoughts. Mill says we need liberty of action, or what he calls experiments in living.
But there's a big catch right away. You can't just do anything. We already established the harm principle.
Right. The limit is always there. You must not make yourself a nuisance to other people. And he gives a very specific and famous example to show the difference between protected speech and unprotected action. The corn dealer.
I found this really helpful. Tell us about the corn dealer.
So Mill says you can write an article or a book with the opinion that corn dealers are starvers of the poor. That is an opinion. It should be circulated. It should be safe. Even if it's a wrong and dangerous opinion, you have the right to publish it.
Okay.
But now imagine there is an angry mob assembled in front of the corn dealer's house. They are holding torches and pitchforks. They are ready to riot. It's a powder keg situation.
Very tense.
Exactly. If you then stand in front of that mob and shout, corn dealers are starvers of the poor, or you wave a placard with those words on it, that is a different thing entirely. That is no longer just expressing an opinion. It is a positive instigation to a mischievous act.
So context matters. The same words that are legal in a book might be illegal when shouted to an angry mob.
Yes. When expression becomes a direct trigger for immediate violence, it loses its immunity. But barring that kind of direct incitement, Mill thinks we should be free to live how we want. And he is deeply, deeply worried that we aren't doing that. He thinks we are becoming a nation of copycats.
He calls conformity ape-like.
He does. He has this great line. He who lets the world, or his own portion of it, choose his plan of life for him has no need of any other faculty than the ape-like one of imitation. If you just do what your parents did, or what your neighbors do, or what you see on social media, you aren't really being human. You're being a monkey.
And he contrasts a machine with a tree.
Yes. This is a beautiful analogy. He says human nature isn't a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it. It is a tree, which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing.
But society lives a machine. It's predictable. It's efficient. A tree is messy. It's unpredictable.
Exactly. And Mill observes that society used to struggle against strong impulses. Back in those barbarian days, we needed to tame people. We needed to control the warlords. But now, in his modern world, society has the better of individuality. The danger now is the deficiency of personal impulses and preferences.
People don't even ask, what do I prefer anymore?
Yeah, no. They ask, what is suitable to my position? Or, what do people of my station and circumstances usually do? He says their minds are bowed to the yoke. They become incapable of strong wishes or native pleasures. They're just beige.
And Mill thinks this leads to a society of mediocrity. He argues that genius, by its very nature, is original, and it can only breathe in an atmosphere of freedom. And this leads to his defense of the eccentric. I love this part. He basically says, be weird. Please, for the love of God, just be weird.
Yes. It's a passionate plea. He says the amount of eccentricity in a society has generally been proportional to the amount of genius, mental vigor, and moral courage it contained. And he warns that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the time.
So if you see someone with blue mohawk walking a ferret on a leash, Mill would say, thank goodness for that guy. He's a sign of a healthy society.
Even if you think it's silly, yes. Because that person breaks the tyranny of custom. They open our eyes. They remind us that there are other ways to be. The unoriginal person might not invent a new way of life, but without the originals, there would be no new ways to choose from.
And he connects this collective mediocrity to democracy again. He says the world is now governed by masses. In England, it was the middle class. In America, the white population. And this leads to mediocre government that reflects the mediocre minds of the masses.
Right. And to balance that, you need these brilliant, eccentric individuals who break the mold. But then he drops the China warning. This feels incredibly prescient for the 19th century, and honestly, even more so for the 21st.
Tell us of the China warning.
Mill looks at China. Now we have to keep in mind he is writing in 1859. He acknowledges they have much talent and, in some respects, even wisdom. They have this incredible system, the civil service exams, to impress the best wisdom of the past on every mind in the governing class.
They basically achieved the philanthropist's dream, making everyone alike, educated, and governed by the best rules, a perfect bureaucracy.
It was. And what was the result? Stationariness. They have become stationary for thousands of years. They invented so many things early on, and then they just stopped. They stopped progressing because they killed individuality. They succeeded in making everyone the same.
And Mill warns that Europe is advancing toward this same Chinese ideal.
Yes. Through modern education, through commerce, through improved means of communication, we're all becoming more and more alike. We all watch the same movies, read the same news, wear the same brands, adopt the same customs.
And we were assimilating.
Exactly. And Mill says we have to defend individuality now while there's still a fight to be had. Because once uniformity is complete, people won't even be able to conceive of diversity. They'll look at it as something impious or monstrous or unnatural.
That is a chilling thought. Okay, section 3, the limits to the authority of society. We've established we need individuality, but now we need to get very specific about where that line is drawn.
Right. Mill draws a distinction between the social domain and the individual domain. The social domain includes conduct that affects the interests of others, specifically their rights. Society can enforce this with law and punishment.
Okay.
The individual domain is conduct affecting only the self or other consenting adults. Here, society has no jurisdiction. The individual's independence is, or ought to be, absolute.
But I want to push on this self-destructive behavior thing again. It's a tough one. If I see my friend drinking himself to death, surely I have a duty to do more than just reason with him.
You have a duty to warn him, yes.
Yeah.
You have a duty to advise him. You can entreat him. Mill says we are not at all indifferent to self-harm. We can even choose to avoid his society, which he calls a natural penalty.
A natural penalty, what does that mean?
It means that if a person is a fool or has what Mill calls faults of self-regard, he will lose the respect of others. People won't want to be around him. Those are the natural, spontaneous consequences of his folly. But we don't have the right to make his life uncomfortable on purpose as a punishment.
So avoidance is okay, but active punishment is not.
Exactly. We can't fire him from a job that doesn't concern us or jail him or egg his house. And Mill makes a distinction here that I think clears it up beautifully. If a man is drunk, that is self-regarding. It's his problem. But if a policeman is drunk on duty, that is a social crime because he is failing in a specific duty to the public.
I see.
If a man spends all his money, that's his business. But if he spends all his money and then fails to feed his children or pay his debts, that is a moral crime. It's the breach of duty that is punishable, not the extravagance itself.
Okay, but here's the big counter-argument, and it's the one everyone uses today, the no man is an island argument. If I hurt myself, I hurt society. If I take drugs, I might end up in a hospital that taxpayers have to fund. If I'm lazy and unproductive, I reduce the national GDP. My private vice has public consequences.
Mill calls this contingent injury. He admits it exists. He's not naive. But he argues society must bear this inconvenience for the sake of the greater good of human freedom. Because if you accept the no man is an island argument to its logical conclusion, there is no private life left. Any action can be argued to have some remote effect on others. It opens the door to the moral police.
The moral police?
Exactly. If my vice harms you just by existing or by setting a bad example, then you have the right to ban my vice. And Mill gives some terrifying examples of where this logic leads if you accept it.
He mentions Muslims banning pork.
Right. To a devout Muslim, eating pork is disgusting. It's an offense to God and to their sense of purity. If we allow the majority to police morals based on their feelings or what they consider social rights, a Muslim majority could and would ban pork for everyone.
Or Spaniards in the past banning non-Catholic worship.
Or the Puritans banning music, dancing, public games, and the theater. or Sabbatarians trying to ban all Sunday amusements. Mill's point is that these are based on God's injury, not man's. It's an attempt to enforce a particular moral or religious code on everyone.
And he really goes after the Alliance, this temperance movement that wanted to ban the sale of alcohol.
Yes. He was furious about this. There was a secretary of this alliance who claimed his social rights were invaded by the simple act of someone else selling strong drink because it created social disorder and tempted people into vice. Mill just called this a monstrous principle.
By monstrous?
Because it's a claim of a right that every other individual shall act in every respect exactly as you think they ought. It effectively destroys all liberty. If your right is for me to behave in a way that you approve of, then I have no freedom left at all.
All right, let's get into the final section, Section 4, Applications. This is where he takes these high-flying principles and tests them on real-world, nitty-gritty problems. And honestly, this is where it gets messy.
Real life is always messier than pure philosophy.
Let's start with economy and trade. Mill is a classic liberal, so you'd expect him to say free trade is a fundamental human right. But he doesn't, does he?
No, he doesn't. This surprises a lot of people. Mill says trade is a social act. When you sell something to someone, it affects others, it affects prices, it affects public safety. Therefore, the principle of individual liberty doesn't apply to trade in the same direct way.
So the government can regulate it?
Yes. The doctrine of free trade, he argues, rests on different grounds, specifically utility. It's just that it is economically better and more efficient to leave it alone. Restrictions are usually bad policy, but they are not necessarily a violation of fundamental liberty.
Okay, so trade is not a fundamental liberty. What about poisons? If I want to buy arsenic, should I be allowed to, even though I could use it to kill someone?
This is a classic dilemma. We want to prevent murder, but poisons also have useful purposes. They kill rats. They have industrial uses. If you ban them outright to stop murder, you stop the useful purposes too. Mill suggests a middle ground he calls pre-appointed evidence. It's essentially smart bureaucracy. Registers, witnesses, labeling. You don't stop the liberty of the buyer, but you create a paper trail that makes the detection of a crime much easier. You track the sale, you label the bottle clearly with the word poison, you require a witness to the sale, you put up hurdles, but you don't build a wall.
That's a really smart solution.
Yeah.
It balances public safety with individual liberty. Now here's a really tricky one. Solicitation. Can I advise someone to do something bad? Mill talks about the pimp and the gambling housekeeper.
This is a really complex case, and he admits it's on the borderline. Mill says fornication and gambling as private acts must be tolerated. They are between consenting adults. But should a man be free to make a living by inciting others to these acts?
Yeah, should the pimp be free to pimp? Should the casino owner be free to run his casino?
There are strong arguments on both sides. One side says, if it's free to do, it must be free to advise. If I can gamble, you should be able to tell me where the best place to gamble is. The other side says, the advisor has a pecuniary interest, a financial motive to promote what is evil. He's not a disinterested party. He is actively stimulating the vice for profit.
So where does Mill land on this?
He leans towards toleration, but he admits it's a difficult case. He suggests that while you can't ban gambling, society might be justified in compelling gambling houses to be secretive, to keep their doors shut, to have no advertising. You reduce the public nuisance and the temptation without banning the private act itself.
Okay, now we get to one of the most crucial and surprising points in the whole book, education. And this really surprised me. Mill is a huge advocate for education, but he absolutely hates state schools.
It is a fascinating paradox, isn't it? Mill argues that bringing a child into the world is a massive responsibility. He thinks it is a moral crime to bring a child into existence without a fair prospect of being able to not only feed its body, but instruct and cultivate its mind. The state should enforce this duty.
So he wants compulsory education.
Absolutely. He thinks it should be the law. If the father can't teach the child himself, he must pay for a teacher. If he's too poor to pay, the state should help, but the father might have to perform some extra labor to work it off. Mill even suggests compulsory public examinations. If a child can't read by a certain age, the father gets a fine.
So he wants the state to force you to get your kid educated, but he doesn't want the state to be the educator.
Exactly. He deeply fears that a general state education is just a contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another. It establishes a despotism over the mind, leading to that Chinese ideal of uniformity.
So he wants a diversity of education.
Yes. The state can provide schools as one competitor among many, just to set a standard of quality, but it should never, ever hold a monopoly.
But wait a minute. If the state is the one writing the exam, can't they just bias the questions? Question 1. In 500 words, explain why the queen is the best ruler in the world.
You've spotted the loophole, and Mill saw it too. This is why he insists the examinations must be purely on facts and positive knowledge, not on opinions or truth.
Give me an example of that.
You wouldn't ask a student, is Anglicanism the one true faith? Because that forces a particular belief. You would ask, what are the core tenets of the Anglican Church? Or what did Immanuel Kant argue regarding the existence of God? You test their knowledge of the arguments, not their adherence to the arguments.
That is a subtle but absolutely massive difference. Finally, he talks about bureaucracy. And he really goes after the idea of a big, powerful government that does everything.
He gives 3 main reasons against it. First, individuals or private groups usually do things better than the government. Second, even if they don't, the act of doing it educates them. It trains them in citizenship. Think of things like jury duty or local administration. It makes you a better, more capable citizen to participate.
And the third and most important reason.
The great evil. Adding unnecessarily to the government's power. He says if all the roads, the railways, the banks, the insurance companies, the universities, and the public charities were all branches of the government, then freedom of the press and democratic institutions would be nominal. We would all be dependent on the state for our jobs and our livelihoods.
He compares the Russian system of his time to the American system.
Yes. In Russia, the Tsar was theoretically all-powerful, but in reality, he was powerless against the bureaucratic body. He could send any one of them to Siberia, but he couldn't govern without them or against their will. They had a tacit veto.
And the Americans.
He says the French and the Americans are different. They're accustomed to self-government. If their central government collapsed, Americans could form a new one and carry on business the next day because they are used to doing things themselves. They aren't helpless and dependent on a bureaucracy to tell them what to do.
And he warns about creating a pedantocracy.
Yes, rule by pedants. If you absorb all the most talented people in the country into the government, then the outside public is incapable of intelligently criticizing it, and the insiders just sink into lazy routine. You need ability outside the government to keep the government on its toes and prevent it from stagnating.
Wow. There is so much there to chew on. So let's try to wrap this up. What is the synthesis here? What's the takeaway?
At the end of the day, it comes back to those 2 maxims. 1, the individual is not accountable to society for his or her actions insofar as these concern the interests of no person but themselves.
Okay.
And 2, the individual is accountable for actions that are prejudicial to the interests of others and may be subjected to social or legal punishment if society thinks it necessary for its protection.
Simple, yet infinitely complex in application.
And his final warning is just so haunting. He says the worth of a state, in the long run, is the worth of the individuals composing it. And a state that dwarfs its men in order that they may be more docile instruments in its hands, even for beneficial purposes, will find that with small men, no great thing can really be accomplished.
With small men, no great thing can be accomplished. That really sticks with you.
It really does.
So here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to mull over. We live in an age of recommendation algorithms that feed us what we already like, of social credit scores, both official and unofficial, and of massive social media shaming that can destroy a person's life in an afternoon.
We absolutely do.
Are we, right now, living in the exact social tyranny that Mill predicted? Is our intense and maybe even understandable desire for safety and comfort and social harmony slowly killing the eccentricity and genius that we need to progress? Are we, without even realizing it, becoming the stationary, uniform society that Mill warned us about?
That is the question, isn't it? Are we trading our vitality for a comfortable conformity?
Something to think about. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. Keep diving deep, and we'll see you next time.